From Toronto, Canada, Earth. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett on Zoomer Radio.
Well, thanks for inviting me into your home. Long-haul truck, RV, camper, taxi, your parents' well-appointed rec room, your loft, that greasy spoon just off the interstate in your cabin in the woods. Hi there to all of you listening in on our flagship station, Zoomer Radio, AM 740 and 96.7 FM here in Toronto. Those of you catching the show on the podcast, of course, which is everywhere. Hi to those of you checking us out on one of our affiliate stations. Those of you listening to The Conspiracy Show via the Conspiracy Show and Zoomer Radio apps, which are both free downloads. Those of you streaming The Conspiracy Show live on YouTube. And those of you in the YouTube live chat room. Incidentally, if you're watching the YouTube channel, please hit that sub button. Where are we, guys? Around 7,100, I think, right?
That's right.
Okay. Yeah, I just pulled my headset out here. Let me just snap that back in. There we go. Sorry about that, folks. Anyway, however and wherever you are listening or watching, I bid thee the warmest of welcomes, and I thank you for your fine company. The owl. I love owls. I've always loved owls. I think, it's a bird of prey, but of all the birds of prey, it's absolutely my favorite. And it's just, there's just something very mystical about it. And of course, it's held a place of reverence and mystique throughout history. And as strange as this might seem, owls are also showing up in connection with the UFO experience. Mike Cleland has collected a wealth of firsthand accounts in which owls manifest in the highly charged moments that surround alien contact or UFO sightings. There is a strangeness to these accounts that defies simple explanation, and this book explores implications, really, that go far beyond what more conservative researchers would dare consider. But the owl connection encompasses more than the UFO experience. It also includes profound synchronicities, ancient archetypes, dreams, shamanistic experiences, personal transformation, and death, of course. From the mythic legends of our ancient past to the first-hand accounts of the UFO abductee, owls are playing some vital role. This is also a deeply personal story we're going to hear. It's an odyssey of self-discovery as Mike grapples with his own owl and UFO encounters. And what plays out, however, is a story of transformation with the owl at the heart of this journey. Mike Cleland is an avid outdoorsman, illustrator, UFO researcher. He's written extensively on the subject of alien abductions, synchronicities, and owls. It was his first-hand experience with these elusive events that have been the foundation for this research. His website, Hidden Experience, explores these events and their connections to the alien contact phenomenon. And he's also the author of The Messengers, Owls, Synchronicity, and the UFO Abductee, and Stories from the Messengers, Owls, UFOs, and a Deeper Reality. He currently resides in the Adirondacks, and we're delighted to have Mike Cleland on The Conspiracy Show. Mike, how are you?
I'm very good. Thank you.
So, how did your life, you had these experiences and you were kind of researching it, but not spending a lot of time on it. But then all of a sudden it just simply took over your life completely.
Once I started writing the book, it took over my life completely. Yeah. I had a handful of events in my life, a handful of experiences that happened. Most of them happened when I was much younger, and I was reading a lot about UFOs. I took it seriously. I had seen some things in my youth that made me say, well, if I've seen this, then I have to take these stories seriously. So reading UFO books became a sort of that was what I was doing in my 40s. So I'm 55 now. So turn the clock back about 11 years. I was 44, and I was living out west near Grand Teton National Park, and I went camping with a friend. It was actually a person I really didn't know that well, and was just for one night. And this was at a point in my life when these events, these memories, I had missing time events, I had UFO sightings, I had, and in my 30s, I actually had a memory of sitting up in bed and looking out my window and seeing 5 skinny gray aliens, you know, walking towards the house, and they were backlit by this bright light. In my mind, I just felt like there was a voice that said, "Now is time to put your head on the pillow and shut down." And that's exactly what I did. I didn't trust that memory, and I didn't even bother the next day to even look in the yard to see if there was any kind of footprints or anything. So, so that was the foundation. So that was sort of boiling there. So, you know, you have the tea kettle on, and then just before it starts to whistle, you can kind of sense, you know, it's getting ready to whistle. And that was kind of my life at that point. I recognized that there was going to be a day I was going to have to look into this stuff, but I did not want to go there. I was ignoring it. I was denying it. I was believing other people's stories. I did not believe my own story.
But that all changed in 2006, I guess.
That all changed in 2006. I was camping, and there was I was having a lovely conversation as the sun was setting, and an owl flew over our head, and then another owl, and then another owl, and there were 3 owls, and they flew above us, and they landed on branches near us, and it continued until the sun went totally down, and we set our sleeping bags. It was a lovely, perfect night in the mountains. We just set our sleeping bags out under the stars and just slept that way. And so looking straight up at the stars would be blotted out for just a half a second as these owls would pass right above our faces close. And they were very quiet. Owls fly very silently.
Yes.
And in that moment, what happened was to have it happen once was pretty cool. We went camping, the same friend, her name is Kristen, we went camping 4 days later, and the exact same thing happens, except this time the owls were even closer. They were landing on the branches right next to us. They were landing on the ground right next to us. I'm convinced they were the same owls. It was a completely different part of the mountains, but I'm convinced it was the same 3 owls. At the time, I didn't talk about it then, I'm talking about it now, I heard this voice in my head that said, this has something to do with the UFOs. And that is how I started. I got all crazy about owls and started researching owls, and that bled over to the UFO research. And I was researching myself, basically. I wanted answers for my selfish reasons. And every person I talked to, whether that was a researcher or an experiencer, someone's had the direct contact experience, I would ask the question, have you had any odd experiences with owls? And it's certainly not 100% of the people, but it's a very real pattern.
Now, had they ever been asked that before?
Mostly not, you know. What happens, you talk to a researcher, and they'll say, I spoke with Bud Hopkins at length about this, and I spoke with other folks that, and they'll say, of course, oh yes, we get owl reports, and then they'll tell of the screen memory of the 4-foot tall owl that appears on a lonely road at night. Now, there's no such thing as a 4-foot tall owl; they simply aren't that big.
Right.
And under hypnosis, the hypnotherapist would say, describe this owl, and the person, this is a kind of apocryphal how I'm describing this because this is any number of cases play out like this. The person would say, well, the owl has a bald head, it's got a little tight-fitting uniform on, it's skinny, it's got big black eyes, and I don't think that's an owl. And then they would be describing most commonly the gray alien that we all recognize.
But you're not talking about a screen memory, because I mean a screen memory could be anything. It could be I think you pointed out it could be a deer, it could be a small child.
A dead relative, sure.
Sure. So this,
yes.
But
so I address in the book. I address the screen memories, and I kind of do it early, and I kind of want to move on. So I address it. It's a marvelous, remarkable stories involving screen memories. But that's not what fascinated me. What fascinated me was that real owls seemed to be showing up. Now, these owls that I saw in the mountains, those were real owls. I was right up close to them. They were owl size. They were about 12 inches tall. They were doing little owl things, and so I feel strongly that those were real owls.
Can I ask you one more thing about that?
Could I ask you one
more thing about that camping experience? And then it happened again, as you say, about 4 days later in Idaho. Now, I do love owls, but this I don't know about them. Aren't they more solitary? I mean, they don't tend to they don't hang out. I mean, they have 3 or 4 owls.
They can.
They can.
Okay. Can hang out in flocks.
Okay.
But They are mostly solitary.
Yeah, that was my understanding.
It's my understanding that a family of owls, like that have been all raised in the nest together, will sometimes be seen together. And so, yes, so it is not, it's uncommon, but it's not unheard of.
Okay.
So what I'm describing is not impossible, but for me, it came at a highly charged moment. And now here's the weird thing. So I remember I said we were having a lovely conversation. I couldn't remember what we were talking about, this woman, Kristen and I. And it was years later, I got a hold of her after I had like written up about these things. I got a hold of her and said, what were we talking about that night the first owl showed up? And she said, oh, I remember exactly what we were talking about. I was giving my most heartfelt definition of what God meant to me. And I was kind of bowled over because that took this already powerful story and it made it sort of transcendent in its power. So you're mixing another whole element into this soup in a way. So that really, that kind of drama kind of painted a lot of these experiences.
Right. And then after that, those two experiences in 2006, your encounters with owls and the accompanying synchronicities really ramped up. I mean, to almost a ridiculous level, right?
It was also, yeah, I actually sort of, and I'm not saying this lightly, I worried for my sanity. It was irrational how many owls I was seeing at extremely highly charged moments. I would be thinking something, and the owls would show up. I would be having a conversation with someone at a highly charged moment, and the owls would show up. And I was quite, like, I was dismissing the ones I was seeing off on the side of the road. Like, if it didn't mean anything, I was kind of like, okay, those don't count. But there were some powerful events, and the synchronicities, all of the synchronicities I was having between about 2006 and 2011-12, which it dialed down a little bit. I felt like I got the point, and all had something to do with UFOs. I was synchronicities involved with UFO researchers, right. Other people. I would get a hold of them, and then I would find out that they, were UFO experiencers. It was a very stressful point in my life.
Well, we're heading into a break here in just a moment, but I just want that to sort of sink in with people. Like I said, I love owls, but I could count on one hand in my 54 years the number of encounters I've had with an owl, maybe even less than one hand, maybe 3 encounters where I've actually, seen an owl in the wild. Now, I've heard owls occasionally, but I mean, you were having, constant encounters. I mean, that's
3 at a time, 2 at a time, 5 at a time, parked out my window. I actually, at a certain point, I said, I am not going to pay attention to owls unless they cross my path. And a day later, I went and declared that out loud. I walked alone into the woods and declared that out loud. And it was a couple days later, I was riding my bike down this main street of this little town I lived in, and an owl, I watched it leap off a tree branch and fly right in front of my path, crossed my path exactly, as I said, demanding my attention, exactly at eye level, and then kind of floated up and alighted onto the tree across on the other side of the street.
All right, we'll take a time out. We'll come back and continue to discuss owls, the messengers, owls, synchronicity, and the UFO abductee, stories from the messengers, owls, UFOs, and a deeper reality. Mike Cleland is right here on The Conspiracy Show. Don't go away.
The truth is not out there. It's right here. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio. corporations, governments, and sometimes entire civilizations. What goes up must come down, and it lands on The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio.
Welcome back. We are talking with Mike Cleland about the connection between owls and UFO encounters, owls and synchronicities. So how did these stories start to come to you? I mean, I know you were blogging about it starting in around 2009. But how were you collecting these stories enough to fill, a volume?
So, yeah, I just, I honestly, right now I'm getting nearly one a day. I'm getting one good owl story a day, and that has been going on since around 2010, 2009. And it's...
Go ahead, yeah.
Most of those arrive through email, and then I'll make a follow-up. I'll often talk to people on the phone or do a long back and forth, with emails. But most of them have been arriving through emails. And then when I was going to UFO conferences too, I would ask people and just talk to people, and people would take me aside and say, "Oh, I have an owl story for you." And I heard the most amazing stories, just remarkable.
And so what is it? Typically they see an owl, then they see a craft, they hear an owl, they see a craft. How does it, is there kind of
any number of variation of that, any variation at all of that. Here, this is almost one of the first ones I got. It was a fellow named Derek. I've met him, and we sat together and drank coffee, and he explained this. He, in his 20s, he was out camping in the desert, and him and his friend, and they looked up and they saw an owl on a cactus staring down at them. It was like they had a little campfire, and it was actually lit up by the light of the campfire, so it was incredibly eerie. Both of them felt this, heavy sensation to it. It flew off. Moments later, a triangle-shaped craft flew absolutely silently above them, and he really worked to try to describe how eerie the flight pattern of that craft was, that it hugged the terrain in this very unnatural way. He later went on to describe a handful of other things that certainly played out in my mind, like the kind of things that a UFO abductee would share: dreams, memories, events in bed, feeling like he was being floated through the wall. He described it as quite dreamlike. So I can't say what truly happened, but what I can. And he also said something. This is another thing that shows up in the book. He said, this whole thing, and starting with the UFOs and these experiences, kind of put him on a spiritual path that eventually led to what he calls it straight up. He says it's straight up a spiritual awakening. And that's something too that shows up in this that I wasn't prepared for when I started the research, how often that'll come up.
Well,
so that's a very typical straight story.
Right.
The stories get progressively stranger on some level as this goes on, as I collect more and more and more.
Well, you've talked about how there is a strangeness and a depth to these accounts that, I think your words were, it demonstrates that our ideas of what UFOs and ETs are all about are simply far too simplistic. What do you mean by that?
Well, okay, so I'll just go tell one little story here. This has from a fellow named Ben. I love this story. There's no UFO in it, though Ben has had experiences that play out like the kind of things an abductee would have. He's very aware of it. He's had missing time. And he is extremely cautious to put a label on himself, but he's also very aware that it's somehow connected to this UFO thing. And he goes right up to the line, but doesn't quite cross it, of calling himself an abductee. So he was with his kids, and I was they were at a roller skating party, a birthday party, and they were all little, and they were in the van. He was driving everyone home, and the car full of kids, and they're like, Dad, come on, tell a story. So he says, okay, and he thought, I'm going to tell the UFO stories, or these kind of, most of them were about synchronicities and missing time. So he told a few stories, and he kind of played them up as campfire stories. And as he finished the final story, which was about missing time, driving at night, an owl flew right in front of this car. And it was punctuated perfectly. He said, I finished telling my last story, whoosh, an owl flies right in front of the car. And it was, he said, oh, well, he almost said it was cliche. That's almost corny. And later, he he has a second story. He was hiking with his kids all day on a trail during the day, not all day, but during the day, and an owl would land on a branch and follow them. They'd walk along, and he'd walk along, and the kids loved it. And this owl would jump from one branch to another and fly ahead on the trail, and then wait for them to pass, and then fly to the next branch and wait for them to pass. The kids loved it, but he was kind of freaked out a little bit. He thought it was scary. So he later that night, same day, says, "Okay, I'll come up and read you a story. Pick a story." And so the kids pick a story called "Say Boo." It's about a ghost who can't say boo. He's unable to say boo. He's lost his voice. So you can kind of see what's going. Very simple little kid's book with pictures. It's Halloween. The ghost needs to scare people, but he goes up to the cow and he can't say boo, so he goes moo. And then there's one point where he goes up to an owl and can't say boo and says who. And so he's reading the story aloud, and he reads the line. And the story, the ghost's name was Ben, just like my friend's name is Ben. He reads the line, and then Ben looked up into a tall pine tree and saw an owl. Right then, the dog starts barking. And the dog's going crazy. He runs downstairs, he opens the door, and looks outside, and there's nothing. And he looks up, and right outside his door is a tall pine tree. So Ben looks up into the tall pine tree and sees an owl. He knew right away that it was the same line he had just read seconds earlier in the book. So in the process of making this book, right, so I had to go back and forth and back. Ben was great. So he was like, no, the story wasn't quite right. You got to change this one line here. It was a little more like this. And so we would work and work and work. His story is all of like 5 or 6 paragraphs. But he gets to a point, he says, you know what? These are the same stories. Me in the van. That's me finding my voice. I found my voice. I told my kids of my real life experience. And the story of the owl, the ghost named Ben finding his voice. He said, these are the same stories. And it really struck him, and it really had a power. I did not notice it. He noticed it. And it really, it changed in some ways, it changed his outlook on these things, that back and forth process and examining these two stories side by side and how they somehow mirrored each other.
My lovely bride, I call her the mighty Aphrodite. She's Greek, and when we go to Greece, we go to Athens, of course, and she's always finding little owls on T-shirts and things, because the owl is the symbol of Athens, because that was Athena's. What would you call that? It was her companion. Yeah, her companion, and the symbol of Athena is the owl. So a couple of weeks ago, she's in a restaurant here, a business lunch, and she looks over, and she sees this beautiful owl on a shopping bag. And it immediately caught her attention because she has this affinity for owls, as I do, and she's in a Greek descent and so forth. So she did something she wouldn't ordinarily do. She actually went over to this table of strangers, and she wanted to know what store in town has an owl as its symbol. And it turns out, I don't know if you're familiar with the rapper Drake, but he is a resident of Toronto, and he has a new store, and that's the symbol for Drake, is the owl. Now, I suppose that's neither here nor there, but it is, I suppose, somewhat synchronous rather, that we are now talking about owls. And I just remembered that story.
The owls are very common, so you have to be very careful. I get a little sometimes I have to kind of. I can walk down the main street or down any city block, and by the time you walk through a whole city block, you're gonna see a few owls.
Right.
There's like owl lunch boxes. There's owl T-shirts. There's little owl bumper stickers. So they're out there.
Right, but but that says something. It says, I guess, something about the strength of the archetype. That we would,
yeah.
Why don't we see ring-tailed lemurs everywhere, or a gecko? Well, you do on some commercials, but the owl. So maybe we should spend a few minutes, and we're coming up on a break, but we'll start the conversation now, and we can talk about it after. And that is about myths about owls, which cut across virtually all cultures and civilizations. I mean, we all talk about owls being wise, but there's also a link between owls and the spirit world, correct?
Absolutely, yeah, and I cover that in depth in my book, and that's a goodly number of the stories I get are connected not with UFOs but with death. So the owl has great big eyes and can see into the dark, right? So they can see into the darkness in a way that we can, using science and our knowledge of how night vision might work in an animal like that, we can understand how it happens. That would have been a complete magical thing for our ancient ancestors.
Yes.
That an owl could not only see into the dark, but fly in the darkness, fly in complete darkness and complete silence. And that quickly turned into a metaphor for, this is all across cultures, that the owl can pass beyond our realm and into another realm. Flying into the darkness becomes a metaphor for crossing the boundaries, crossing the veil, whether they go to the land of the dead or the land of our ancestors or the land of the gods, or the land of the UFO occupants. They, in the mythology, in that sense, they have that ability. Then they have to return. And they return often with a message. And I cannot tell you how many, without any prompting, this is how the title of the book arrived, really, in a way, is that so many letters. They would just call, they would not refer to the owl. They would refer to, this owl showed up in my yard, and it was really interesting, and it came up at a certain time. And then the remainder of the letter, they would call it the messenger. And then the messenger sat on a branch, and it just was happening naturally. And that really struck me, that these were not people. These were not, people. They weren't graduate students of mythology at a Ivy League college. These were just people who happened to see an owl in their yard.
Right. And there, of course, the owl. You see them on totem poles. It is a totem. It's a totem of what? I mean, we talked about it being a messenger, but I think you described it as a totem of the initiate. What does that mean exactly?
Well, I would almost say, so there's a couple ways to look at it. Now, I'm very cautious. This is the core question of the book, or both books. The core question is, why owls, right? So I'm wrestling with that constantly. I don't have a great answer. I can dance around it and come up with some ideas. So if the owl, one thought is that the owl represents the initiation process, right? So the fellow earlier I talked about, Derek, right? He sees an owl on a cactus, he sees a UFO, later he has a spiritual awakening. Traces it all back to that UFO sighting, which was also a UFO and owl sighting. So is that announcing initiation? Is that the role of the owl, right? I mean, is that what's happening? It's a very clean way to look at it. It lines up. The puzzle pieces click together nicely. Another way to look at it is the owl is the totem of the transformational process. And I feel that, so seeing a UFO can change people's lives, right?
Let me just
you are immediately confronted with something that everyone says is not real, can't happen, and your idea of reality is forever altered.
All right, Mike, I've got to take a timeout. We'll come back. I want to talk to you also about Dolores Cannon, her experience, and I believe it was a gentleman who saw an owl sort of drop out of the sky, and we'll discuss how that related to a UFO as well. Back with more of The Conspiracy Show. Mike Cleland here, talking owls and synchronicities, right here on The Conspiracy Show.
This is no place for the naive or the faint-hearted. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio. This is no place for the naive or the faint-hearted. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio.
Just a couple of programming notes. Next week, Matt Landman will be here to talk about chemtrails. He has a documentary. And actually, if you go to the website, strangeplanet.ca, and then find the radio page for the Conspiracy Show, and we have that slide carousel up at the top, Albert has posted in one of those slides. If you click on it, just wait for it to come around, and it's the Matt Landman chemtrail documentary, and it's there. You can watch it. It's not just the trailer, right, Albert? It's the whole thing?
The whole thing for free.
It's the whole thing for free.
Yeah.
That's how badly Matt wants this out there.
He's a true believer.
I'll say. Okay, so Matt Landman, and then in the second hour, Michael Dougherty. We'll talk about the devil in the Beltway. Obviously, the Beltway referring to Washington, D.C. Now, last week, we had David John Oates talking about reverse speech, and we did a terrific hour with him. Now, he's coming back. I kind of teased this a little. Some people were kind of upset because we didn't devote a lot of time to it. I wanted to save it for another whole show. The JFK reversals. We're going to do a full 2 hours, is it, Albert?
Yeah, he says he believes he solved it. He can say who did it.
Right, but we're doing 2 hours.
Yeah, he's booked for 2 hours.
And when is that happening?
I would have to check the calendar to get the exact date, but it's will be in April.
It's in April. Okay,
Yeah.
so coming up in April, we're going to do 2 hours on reverse speech, all relating to the JFK assassination. So we'll hear reverse speech from Oswald and probably Ruby, and all the players. So anyway, keep an eye out for that. Just a reminder also about my new podcasts, Conspiracy Unlimited. It drops 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. You can go to conspiracyunlimitedpodcast.com. And then, of course, the brand new one, just 3 weeks in now, the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. And that drops every Wednesday. That's part of the Jericho Network with Chris Jericho in association with Westwood One. And again, that's the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone, and that drops every Wednesday. Michael Cleland is here, and we are talking about owls and UFOs. And I wanted to ask you about Dolores.
Oh, here, let me just. There's a whole chapter in the book. I did a reverse speech session with Wayne Nicholson, who's a reverse speech, I guess, therapist. I'm not sure what you
Yes,
call
that's
him.
right. He's the other player in this field. Absolutely. Talk about synchronicities. Yes, please.
Yeah, that was. So when you said that, I was like, hey. So the book ends with with a couple of the accounts that he shared. Like, I did the chapter and I couldn't. There was some that I was like, oh my God, this has to end the entire book. Where basically I said, I slept in the desert. There's a story where I sleep in the desert, and I said this. I slept in the desert, and I had an owl sighting, or heard an owl and a UFO, and it's a very complicated story. It takes like many pages at the end of the book and I'm discussing that with Wayne Nicholson, and he plays it backwards, and I can't remember the exact line. I'd have to look it up in the book. But I say something to the effect of, it wasn't just one event. It was all these events. And then he played that backwards, and some of them are a little faint, right? You have to kind of listen close, but this was very plain. It was my voice backwards saying, many owls.
There you go.
And that kind of,
that's called a congruency. In other words,
yeah.
you're confirming in your backward speech what you said in your forward speech, which means that's authentic. You're being authentic.
And so he said something which surprised me, which I didn't know that much about it. But he said he'd done these for years, and he said I had no, incongruent. I'd have to look up exactly. I did write it in the book. He said I had no negative or contrary things show up in my reverse speech. They were all confirmational.
Right. Amazing. So I wanted to ask you about Dolores Cannon, who, of course, we know from her work in regression therapy and so forth. Tell me about that. I mean, I know it involves a screen memory, but then there's something sort of more to that story.
This is a wonderful story. Yeah. So Dolores Cannon was at the point in her career. I can't remember where this would have been. So she was at the point in her career where she was doing straight therapy, and she started drifting into this more spiritual aspects. And she was getting people who were, she was doing hypnotherapy on quitting smoking and losing weight and just reducing stress, normal stuff. and she had she was finding people like this UFO stuff was coming up, and she had to decide whether to follow it. And she met with some of her colleagues and had the discussion that night, like, do I follow this? This is presenting itself, this UFO stuff. I don't know what to make of it. Do I follow it? Do I pull on these threads? That night, as she drives home, driving in the dark, she gets to her road in rural Arkansas, and she's driving along, and there's an owl on the road, and she pulls right up to it. Now, this is something I've heard often, and she describes it. She said she's in her truck, and the owl looked right over the top of the hood and stared at her. There's no owl in the world that can stand. Even if you take a small car and a big owl,
That's right.
still can't look at you
No.
over the hood. The owl flew down the highway. She drove up to it again. It stared at her. Owl flew down the highway. She drove up to her. It stared at her. Went all the way to her door, right, or like to her driveway, until she turned off the highway. And years later, she's giving a talk when she was doing. At this point she's giving talks all over the world about her research. She's in London, and she goes to the British Museum, and there's a big booth which has all kinds of it's an owl display. So there's all kinds of owls of different sizes and
Taxidermied.
And she looks and says, these are all too small. I don't know what I saw, but it wasn't an owl. Now, the important part of this story to me is that this was the night she had to decide on whether she was going to follow the UFO trail, which she obviously did. So this is that thing, the totem of initiation, right?
Right.
This is a perfect example, but it's playing out not as a real owl, because she was seeing something that's too big to be a real owl. What happened? What actually happened? I cannot say. I can speculate and dance around it, but I truly don't know. Now here's another little odd thing. So I had that story written up. There's a woman. She did a wonderful movie about synchronicities, and she the movie is called Time is Art, and her husband did this wonderful movie about synchronicity. Her name is Katie Walker.
Can I get you to just hold on to the rest of the story? Apologies.
Oh, sure.
We're going to duck into another break, come back, and we'll get right to that story. Synchronicities. Michael Cleland, Owls and UFOs. Back with more. Stay with us.
Where there's smoke, there's The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio.
I've never been to a funeral and seen somebody's net worth statement proudly
Corporations. Got something to say? Call Richard Syrett now at 416-360-0740. or toll free at 1-866-740-4740.
Mike Clellan stays with us. The Messengers, Owls, Synchronicity, and the UFO Abductee, and stories from the Messengers, Owls, UFOs, and a Deeper Reality. So you were telling us about this documentary this woman made about synchronicities.
She's making a documentary now. This is the problem with trying to tell these stories, because you kind of got to, every thread you pull on, you unravel a different part of the tapestry. She was shooting owls in a shooting video. She was shooting video of owl murals in the Mission District of San Francisco. So she sets the camera down. That's part of the doc. She's the doc, and the camera. She didn't realize the camera was still going. As the camera's set down, they don't realize it until during the editing. They catch this big, seemingly metallic thing for just a few seconds as it passes across the frame and behind a tree. Very remarkable little clip of footage. So here's a woman making a documentary on UFOs, on synchronicity, photographing owls, and captures a UFO. She contacts me. I talked with her about this. I loved this story. She contacted me and she said, "Oh, you know who you need? You need to include the story from Dolores Cannon." And she sends me this letter, and it arrives at my email in the morning, and it goes chunk to chunk to chunk, and I just watch it when I turn my computer on. It repeats 19 times. And I get back to her and I'm like, "Katie, what's up? You sent me the same story about Dolores Cannon 19 times." She said, "No, I didn't. I just sent it once." That arrived 19 times. She was telling me to read Dolores Cannon. She actually sent me a copy of Dolores Cannon's book as a PDF in that where that story occurs.
Right.
That was on October 18th, 2014, the day Dolores Cannon died. There was some mix-up where there was, it was powerful.
Right.
That so many emails would mistakenly just line up, boom, 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 19 of them on my email inbox.
That's right.
All the same one.
Here they are beating you over the head again. Pay attention to this. Pay attention to this. Tell me about this fellow, this account of an owl basically just dropping out of the sky right in front of his car and landing on the pavement.
This story actually came from Jacques Vallée. I was shameless when I was working on this book. I got a hold of everyone I could possibly think of, and I said, "Do you have an owl story?" And I sent a paper letter to Jacques Vallée. It doesn't have there's no email address or anything, so I sent him a paper letter. I said, "Do you have any?" He wrote a letter back, and he said, "Yes, I do." And he explained very carefully this. Two people were in a car. They were driving at night, and they had to stop on the highway because an owl plopped straight down, landed on the highway in front of them, was kind of flopping around like it was disoriented. And then as they're parked there looking at this owl, they look up and they have a close-up sighting of a hovering UFO, a hovering flying saucer. So this is the way Jacques Vallée cautiously speculated. He certainly didn't know, but he cautiously speculated that there must be something within the field of the UFO that disrupted this owl and caused it to flop around. That's one of the questions they ask in any kind of UFO sighting report, is there any animal disturbances, dogs whining or cats acting nervous. So here's an owl plopping out of the sky. Now, this is interesting because if you really truly think of all the animals in the animal kingdom, the owl has probably the best hearing of all animals, specifically all birds, has the best hearing. So is it capable of is its hearing so sensitive that the seeming silence or whatever of the UFO was emanating some energy that disrupted its ability to fly? I'm speculating myself. I simply don't have the answer. But that's very telling.
Especially the barn owl that has that flat face. It's almost like a parabolic receiver.
It's exactly what it is. And their ears are lined up very, very close to the edge of so our ears are on the side of our head. Their ears are a little closer to the front of their face. So they can actually fly at night. And they can how would you say it, where you can target, they can look and they can target the sound. So where they look, they know exactly where they're looking, where the sound is coming from. So they can fly at night in the darkness, in flight, and hear a mouse on the ground.
Mm. They are remarkable. I mean, never mind the UFO aspect. Just being in the presence of an owl, or there's YouTube channels dedicated to owls. Just being in the presence of an owl is a pretty remarkable, intense experience. Never mind the UFOs.
Yeah, and it's in owls. So both owls and UFOs are marked by their eerie silence, and everyone recognizes that. Like these people will see an owl in flight and they'll go, "It was so quiet. It was shocking." And that's the same thing you hear in a UFO report.
So it's like, do you feel like you're getting close, but then, oh, that's not it? It's elusive, isn't it? This connection.
I've given up. I'm at peace now with that emotion you're describing there. So it made me crazy for a few years, and now I just had to sort of throw my hands up and say, this will remain a mystery. I will not solve this mystery, but I can. I mean, there's something wonderful and seductive about a mystery, so that's fine. But I feel like I can try to paint a picture of or create a mood with these stories, because I think that's what they're meant to be, almost, is have that flavor and that mood.
So we're not meant to find out the deeper meaning here.
Well, we're certainly meant to struggle with it, I feel. I don't know if we'll ever find it out. Maybe someone, who knows? There's it depends on which way the wind blows, right? On a Monday I have one idea, on a Tuesday I have something else, and I'm completely at the whim of whatever the next story that crosses my desk might be.
Were you ever at a point where you and you could maybe share where you thought you had unraveled the mystery, but then you found out, no, that's not it either? Not even no.
No, not. I mean, I certainly, the problem was much of my initial was the mystery was, well, there was certainly a point when I got to where I realized I had my own contact experiences, which I was denying like crazy, and that's the last 40 pages of the first book, The Messengers. Me coming to terms with those experiences that my confirmation experience, where it became confirmed to me. So I feel like I'm directly involved somehow. Don't ask me why and what it means, but I feel certain I've had involvement with this, with the, what we'd call abduction.
Well, what would, if you were to go to a shaman, and just, never mind the UFO aspect, just your encounters with owls, what would a shaman say?
Well, that's what I try to address in the books. The way I say it is, I have to take off my UFO investigator hat, push it aside, and put on my shaman hat and ask the questions a shaman would ask. So, what was going on in your life leading up to this experience? What has changed in your life after? Those are the simplest questions, and it's remarkable. What I'll get. I mean, there's so many accounts of people seeing UFOs at a point of existential crisis. And that shows, and there's also, it's very, very common in UFO reports, people saying, you know what, I would like to see a UFO, and then boom, they see a UFO. That's surprisingly common. And I also have many accounts where people are, hiking, and they'll be in the woods and the sun will be setting, and they'll say, they'll turn to the person next to them, wouldn't it be cool to hear an owl hoot? Bam, before they finish the sentence, an owl hoots. So there's this confirmation like that too. Oh, now your original question, I get back to.
What would the shaman say if you were to ask a shaman about the?
What I would ask a shaman, yeah. So I would ask a shaman what it all means. And I I don't know how. I actually have asked some shamans, and that's just one of the questions. This is the answer I got from David Weatherly, who's an author, and he's the author of the book The Black-Eyed Children. He is also a shaman. He does not talk about this much. He does. He's public about it, but he's got kind of two personas, and one is the author of paranormal books, and the other is doing shamanic work. And I asked him, what is going on with all the owls? This was at the point when I was losing my mind seeing so many owls. I said, what is going on with all the owls? And he said it to me privately. He said, it sounds like a shamanic initiation.
Had he had owl experiences?
He had the best owl experience. He is doing UFO research and paranormal research, and he's going to a house where there's the mom at the house is saying that she's been having a lot of UFO sightings and it's playing out like UFO contact. So he pulls up to the house in his truck. He's parked out front, and he's got his portable handheld recorder in his hand. And he's putting fresh batteries in because he's going to go interview this woman. And he's looking down at putting the batteries in the front seat of his truck. And then there's a gentle thud right in front of him. And he actually feels the car like dip down, like there's a weight on the car. And he looks up, and there's an owl that has landed on the hood of his car and is staring at him in the eyes. So this is a shaman at the house of someone who's having UFO contact, and they have an owl land on their car and stare at them in the eyes upon arrival. Announced initiation. So now another one. Here's another story. So David is a friend of mine, David Weatherly, and he's a shaman. And so I wrote a lot about shaman in the very first long essay that I wrote, which would have been back in 2013, I think. So I said, I'm not a shaman. What do I know about this? So I sent it to him and said, can you review this and just make sure I'm not talking out of my, talking out of my hat? And he said, sure. So gets back to me a couple days later. Says, here, a funny thing happened as I was reading your essay. I'm at my desk, I'm reading your essay, and this this thing flies past the window. And I look out the window, and on the tree branch right out my window is an owl. And I said, how long have you lived at that house? He said, 22 years. How many owls have you seen? Oh, I've never seen an owl. So you are reading my essay. A shaman is reading my essay about owls and shamanism. This is what I asked him to read. And you see an owl out your window. I said, yep. Now, unravel that. This is what I'm saying. It is not as simple as little aliens in a metal spaceship coming here from another galaxy in order to somehow study us. Something more elusive and more playful is at hand.
Maybe we should do an experiment. Everyone listening tonight, I want you to say to yourself, I want to see an owl tonight. Let's see what happens. If you see an owl, if you hear an owl, why don't you shoot me an email? Mike, I've enjoyed this thoroughly. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a delight.
MikeClellan.com, hiddenexperience.blogspot.com, themessengersbook.blogspot.com, coldcasewriter.com. All right. My thanks to Ian Robertson, Young Zachary, Albert Vinzel, Ryan White. Ryan, not Randy. Actually called him Randy last week. Fatigue, my friend. That's all that was. All right, back with chemtrails next week and the devil in the Beltway. In the meantime, don't be afraid. There's nothing concealed that won't be revealed and nothing hidden that won't be made known. What you hear in the dark, speak in the light. What I say in a whisper, proclaim from the housetops. Move over, Aphrodite. I'm coming home. Good night.